A soft light spread across the mountaintop, brushing the morning clouds with hues of pink and gold. The air was cool and smelled faintly of wild thyme and damp stone. Ares, the young god, stood near a quiet brook, watching the water ripple over smooth stones, its gentle murmurs harmonizing with the distant wind. Even as a god of war, he found peace in these early hours, before the sun fully climbed the sky. He bent and let his fingers brush the surface of the stream, feeling the cold rush over his skin. The sensation was simple, yet grounding. Around him, the forest stirred with subtle sounds, the hum of bees, the soft flutter of wings, and the occasional rustle of leaves as small creatures began their day. Ares inhaled deeply, savoring the quiet rhythm of the world before any clamor of battles or debates reached Olympus. Though his siblings often boasted of cleverness or beauty, Ares felt his own presence as a steady pulse beneath his skin, raw and certain. There was a strange comfort in knowing he could be both fierce and calm, that strength could exist alongside stillness. The streams and hills did not judge him, they simply were. He wandered along the brook, following its curves, noticing the way the sunlight danced upon the water. He knelt to touch the wet stones, feeling the textures under his palm, and for a moment, he thought of how small and fleeting mortal lives might appear against the endless span of mountains and forests. Yet even in their brevity, he could sense courage, hesitation, curiosity, all the quiet dramas that unfolded in human hearts. As he walked, Ares' thoughts drifted to his father Zeus. The mighty king of gods was known for thunder and authority, a presence that could shake even the strongest mortals. Yet there was a gentleness in Zeus that few noticed, hidden beneath his commanding voice. Ares remembered the times he had watched his father from a distance, observing how he moved through the palace of Olympus, how his gaze lingered on clouds or rivers with subtle fascination, as if he, too, found wonder in small details. Ares' own reflection in the water caught his attention. The sunlight traced the edges of his face, highlighting the strength in his jaw and the clarity in his eyes. He could feel the stirring of something that would later define him, a passion that was neither wholly violent nor entirely tame, a yearning to understand both conflict and its calm counterpart. In the quiet of the forest, he allowed himself to imagine a day when he would step into the hearts of mortals and gods alike, not as a storm, but as a presence that could awaken both courage and contemplation. From behind a line of silver birches, a soft rustling made him pause. A small fawn emerged, its ears twitching as it took tentative steps forward. Ares crouched slightly, not to frighten it, and the fawn regarded him with wide, cautious eyes. There was a gentle understanding between them, a shared recognition of stillness and watchfulness. When the fawn finally bounded away, leaving delicate prints in the soft earth, Ares felt a quiet joy stir within him. He continued deeper into the forest, where light pooled in gentle patches on mossy ground. Each step brought new textures, from the crunch of fallen leaves to the damp softness beneath his sandals. Birds called to each other from high branches, their voices like tiny songs carried on a wind. Ares closed his eyes for a moment, listening to the layered sounds, feeling the pulse of life around him, and imagining the hidden movements of creatures he would never see. The forest had a rhythm, and he found himself matching it unconsciously, each heartbeat slow and steady. Eventually, he reached a small clearing where sunlight poured over a circle of smooth stones. The stones seemed arranged with care, as if the earth itself had decided to offer a resting place. Ares sat down, letting the warmth of the sun touch his shoulders, and allowed his mind to wander. He thought of the warriors of mortal lands, who trained and struggled, who knew fear and triumph in a single breath. He wondered how he might influence them someday, not by command, but through inspiration, through the subtle presence of courage, determination, and careful thought. A gentle breeze brushed his face, carrying the faint scent of distant flowers. Ares inhaled and exhaled slowly, letting the wind carry away any lingering tension. He imagined the world as a place of gentle contrasts, where battle could exist alongside peace, and where even a god of war could find moments of quiet reflection. The thought was comforting, a reminder that even in a life destined for action, there was room for stillness. As the day moved forward, the sunlight shifted, creating long, soft shadows across the forest floor. Ares rose and stretched, feeling the energy of the morning settle into his limbs. He followed a narrow path that led him toward the ridge of a hill, from which he could see the distant shimmer of Olympus. The marble palaces gleamed faintly in the light, their outlines softened by clouds drifting lazily across the sky. He paused at the top of the hill, letting the wind tug gently at his hair, and gazed toward the horizon. A subtle excitement stirred within him, not a rush, but a gentle curiosity about the experiences yet to come. Somewhere beyond the mountains and forests, there would be lessons to learn, faces to meet, and quiet victories to witness. And though the world might not yet know it, Ares' presence would leave traces of courage and strength, gentle reminders of the power that came not from harshness, but from understanding. With a final glance at the distant peaks of Olympus, Ares began to descend the hill, each step deliberate, careful, and steady. The soft rustle of grass beneath his feet harmonized with the distant song of a stream and the whisper of wind through branches. As he moved, he imagined the unfolding of countless mornings just like this one, moments of calm before any storm, the gentle stirrings of a life that would blend force with mindfulness, action with reflection. The path led him into another grove, where sunlight filtered through leaves in golden patches. Birds flitted from branch to branch, and somewhere close by, a brook chuckled softly over stones. Ares crouched once more, listening, absorbing the subtle layers of the forest's voice. He allowed himself a small smile, sensing a quiet anticipation for the days to come, a promise of discovery, growth, and the gentle unfolding of his own path. And as he rose again, stepping onto the soft, mossy trail, he felt the world hold its breath with him, as if waiting for his first gentle stride into the experiences that would shape him. His heart beat in quiet rhythm with the forest around him, each pulse a steady reminder that even the mightiest god had beginnings marked by wonder, curiosity, and the soft touch of a morning breeze. Ares took one last deep breath, the scent of earth and sunlight filling his lungs, before continuing forward. Somewhere beyond the horizon, beyond the hills and streams, the first stirrings of his journey awaited, a path that would weave through courage, learning, and quiet reflection. And with each step, the forest seemed to murmur its soft approval, guiding him gently toward the unknown. The sunlight filtered through the trees, scattering across Ares' path in warm, dancing patches. He bent down, brushing his fingers over a line of moss creeping along a stone. The cool texture pressed gently against his skin, and he felt the slow, quiet heartbeat of the forest under his touch. Somewhere above, a bird flitted between branches, its wings brushing leaves in a soft rhythm. Ares stepped forward, noticing the small footprints of a fox leading toward a shallow hollow. He crouched to follow them, his eyes tracing each delicate impression in the soil. His mind hummed with curiosity, imagining where the creature had gone, how it moved through its world with such careful precision. The air smelled faintly of pine and damp earth, carrying the subtle sweetness of unseen flowers tucked into shadowed corners. The hollow opened onto a gentle glade, sunlight spilling across wildflowers swaying lightly in the breeze. Ares walked among them, fingertips grazing petals, feeling their fragile resilience beneath his touch. A small stream curved through the center, water glinting as it flowed over smooth stones. He knelt beside it, letting the cool liquid slide over his hands, listening to the soft murmur as it wandered further into the forest. A sudden rustle from a nearby bush drew his attention. A rabbit emerged, ears twitching, eyes wide. Ares crouched lower, watching its delicate movements. He imagined its heart beating, quick and steady, and felt a quiet kinship with the small, alert creature. When the rabbit hopped away into the undergrowth, Ares rose, brushing leaves from his tunic. The path twisted upward toward a rocky rise. Ares climbed, feeling the rough stone beneath his hands and the soft wind brushing his face. At the top, the forest spread below him, a sea of green and gold, the distant peaks of Olympus faintly gleaming through a veil of mist. He stood for a moment, toes gripping the stone, feeling both the height and the stillness around him. A sudden movement caught his eye, a falcon circling high above. Its wings glided effortlessly, tipping and catching the wind. Ares tilted his head, tracing the arcs, imagining the freedom of flight, the clarity of seeing the world from above. His chest lifted slightly with quiet excitement, not from urgency, but from the awareness of the possibilities ahead, the paths he might explore. He descended carefully, each step finding balance among uneven stones and tree roots. A soft hum of bees drifted from a patch of golden flowers, brushing against his fingers as he passed. He closed his eyes for a moment, inhaling the fragrance, feeling the warm sun on his shoulders. Each breath felt like a quiet affirmation of presence, a small connection to the life thriving around him. The forest thickened, shadows lengthening as the sun shifted. Ares paused beside a towering oak, running his palm along its bark, rough and strong. He imagined the years it had stood, storms weathered, leaves shed, and new buds born each spring. The tree seemed to hold patience in its form, and he felt a subtle echo of his own desire to grow, to understand the patterns of life around him. He walked along a narrow trail, the soft crunch of leaves underfoot blending with distant bird calls. A small stream crossed his path again, its surface flickering with reflected sunlight. He knelt to cup water into his hands, watching the droplets slip through his fingers, and felt a quiet satisfaction in the simple movement. The air was warm now, carrying the faint scent of honey and wild mint, lingering as he continued along the winding trail. Ares noticed the first signs of wild berries along the path, dark and plump against the green leaves. He picked a few, tasting their gentle sweetness, feeling the subtle energy of the forest settle into him. A fox darted across the path, pausing briefly to regard him with bright eyes before disappearing into the brush. Ares smiled faintly, sensing the quiet dialogue of creatures around him, the way the forest seemed alive with small, intimate stories unfolding all at once. He reached a gentle clearing where sunlight pooled across smooth stones. The air was still, except for the whisper of a distant stream and the rustle of leaves. Ares sat on a stone, stretching his legs, letting the warmth seep into him. He ran his fingers along the edges, noticing the slight imperfections in the surface, the subtle texture that made each stone unique. He imagined stepping along each path carefully, aware of every sound, scent, and sight, attuning himself to the quiet pulse of the world. A breeze shifted, carrying the faint scent of distant flowers and wet earth. Ares closed his eyes, letting it brush against his face, letting the soft movement of the air brush through his hair. Somewhere in the distance, a bird sang, small and steady, its song winding through the forest like a gentle thread. Ares leaned back on the stone, feeling the warmth of sunlight on his back, and let his thoughts wander, imagining days yet to come, the gentle unfolding of experiences and encounters that awaited him. As the sun moved lower, shadows stretching across the forest floor, Ares rose, brushing the dust from his tunic. The forest seemed to hum softly around him, life continuing in quiet patterns, undisturbed and steady. He walked toward a narrow path that wound deeper into the trees, each step measured, calm, and deliberate. The faint glimmer of distant peaks guided his eyes, while the soft murmur of streams and rustling leaves filled his ears. Ares paused briefly at the edge of a small hill, watching sunlight filter through branches, casting delicate patterns on the earth. He imagined the creatures hiding in shadow, the streams winding through unseen valleys, and the wind brushing across distant ridges. Each element seemed connected, subtle, and quiet, and he felt a steady curiosity about the paths he had yet to follow. The forest opened again into a gentle meadow, soft grass bending under his sandals. Tiny flowers swayed as he walked, brushing against his knees. Ares crouched to examine a cluster, inhaling the faint sweetness and marveling at their intricate patterns. He stood again, feeling the gentle incline of the land beneath his feet, the soft rhythm of the breeze against his skin. The sunlight shifted, casting long, warm shadows across the meadow. Ares walked toward a distant grove, hearing the soft chatter of water over stones, each sound layered with the rustle of leaves and the hum of insects, forming a quiet symphony that carried him forward. The path was unhurried, each step deliberate, each breath connecting him to the living world around him. And as he reached the edge of the grove, the first hints of evening began to settle across the sky, softening the light into gentle shades of gold and rose. Ares paused, fingers brushing the bark of a tree, listening to the faint rustle of leaves. Somewhere, a small stream gurgled over stones, its rhythm steady and reassuring. The world felt patient, and he moved through it carefully, step by step, aware of every texture, sound, and movement. The morning mist hung low over the forest, curling around the roots of trees and the edges of stones. Ares felt the cool droplets settle on his skin as he stepped carefully along a narrow path, each footfall pressing softly into the damp earth. He could hear the faint trickle of a hidden stream somewhere beneath the undergrowth, and the distant hum of wings brushing against the moist air. A rustling sound drew his gaze to a small group of deer emerging from the shade. Their fur was flecked with sunlight, and their delicate movements were precise and unhurried. Ares crouched slightly, letting the silence stretch between them, and felt a quiet admiration for the way the animals navigated the forest without hesitation. One of the younger deer paused, eyes meeting him for a brief moment, before bounding gracefully into the deeper trees. Ares followed with his gaze until it disappeared from sight, the sound of hooves muffled by soft moss. The trail opened into a shallow glade where sunlight pooled in golden patches. Ares knelt beside a cluster of ferns, brushing leaves between his fingers, noting the fine texture, the subtle veins, the way they caught the light. Each small detail seemed to hold a story of growth and persistence, a quiet testament to life continuing with patient rhythm. The faint scent of wet earth rose from the soil, earthy and soothing, mingling with the aroma of distant wildflowers. He rose and continued along the path, the soft brush of grass against his legs and the uneven stones beneath his feet keeping him aware of each step. Somewhere nearby, the chattering of squirrels echoed through the branches, and he paused to watch one leap from a tree limb to another, its movements precise and effortless. Ares marveled at the small elegance of creatures that moved without thought yet with perfect balance. The forest thickened as he advanced, and the light shifted, slipping through leaves in dancing patterns. Ares ran his hand along the bark of a tree, feeling the ridges and bumps under his fingers. He pressed his palm to the trunk, sensing the slow, steady pulse of growth within, imagining the years it had withstood storms, sun, and wind. A subtle thrill passed through him, not of force, but of presence, a connection to the world that stretched beyond himself. He came upon a shallow brook, its waters clear and sparkling. Ares knelt and cupped a handful, letting the liquid slip through his fingers. Tiny pebbles shifted beneath his touch, and the water gurgled softly over them. The sound was steady and calm, rhythmic like a heartbeat, and he listened for longer than necessary, allowing the melody to fill the quiet spaces within him. A sudden movement caught his eye. A heron stepped delicately from the reeds, long legs navigating the shallow water with careful precision. Its feathers glistened in the morning sun, and Ares held his breath as it paused, tilting its head with quiet curiosity. The bird's gaze met him for a fraction of a moment before it lifted into the air, wings spreading wide and carrying it smoothly across the glade. Ares tilted his head, watching the arc of its flight, the way the wind supported each motion. He traced the brook along its winding course, feeling the shift from stone to soft mud beneath his sandals. Tiny fish darted beneath the surface, glinting like shards of silver in the light. Ares knelt again, dipping his hands into the cool water, and felt a steady calm settle through him. The forest seemed to hold a rhythm, each element contributing to a delicate, invisible melody that he was learning to follow. As he rose, he noticed a grove of tall pines ahead, their needles brushing gently against one another. The air smelled faintly of resin, rich and sweet, grounding him with each inhalation. Ares walked beneath their shade, noticing the interplay of shadow and light on the forest floor, the way small insects traced patterns over moss and fallen leaves. His eyes followed a line of ants carrying tiny morsels of food, moving in perfect coordination along their hidden path. The ground sloped upward toward a ridge, and Ares climbed carefully, feeling the rough texture of stone beneath his hands. From the top, he could see a patchwork of forest, glade, and stream stretching toward distant mountains. The sunlight caught the peaks of Olympus, marble gleaming faintly in the haze. He took a deep breath, the cool wind brushing against his face, the scent of pine and wet stone filling his senses. A soft rustle near a cluster of bushes drew his attention. A fox appeared, its fur bright in the filtered sunlight, tail flicking as it watched him. Ares crouched slowly, remaining still as the animal studied him. Its eyes shone with intelligence, and for a moment he felt the quiet connection of two beings aware of one another's presence without words. The fox darted away, leaving a trail of paw prints in soft earth. Ares knelt to examine them, tracing each tiny mark with his fingertips. He continued along the ridge, stepping over roots and stones, each movement deliberate. The forest hummed around him with subtle life, the rustle of leaves, the distant drip of water, the occasional call of a hidden bird. Ares inhaled deeply, feeling the energy of the forest flow through him in gentle pulses. He imagined the countless unseen moments of life happening simultaneously: insects tending their young, birds tending nests, flowers slowly turning toward the sun. The path led to a gentle slope covered with wildflowers. Ares crouched, letting his hands glide over petals, feeling their delicate resilience. A small breeze stirred, carrying the scent of earth, flowers, and pine. He tilted his head, listening to the harmony of sound: the whisper of wind, the soft murmur of the brook, the distant call of a hawk. Each note blended seamlessly into the next, forming a rhythm that pulsed through him, steady and reassuring. He paused near a stone circle, weathered smooth over time, moss creeping along its edges. Ares ran his fingers across the surface, tracing its curves and cracks. The stones seemed to hold the weight of countless days, quiet markers of a world that continued to grow, change, and endure. He rested briefly, letting the warmth of sunlight touch his shoulders and the breeze brush his hair. The ridge sloped downward toward a hidden valley. Ares descended carefully, feeling the soft soil and scattered stones beneath his feet. He noticed the delicate patterns of shadow cast by leaves above, the small flicker of dragonflies over a sunlit puddle, and the subtle scent of damp earth rising from the valley floor. The forest seemed alive with movement, yet calm, each creature and plant existing in quiet coordination. Ares reached the valley floor, stepping into a small clearing where the sunlight formed golden patches across soft grass. He bent to examine a cluster of tiny wildflowers, brushing petals between his fingers, tasting their faint sweetness on his tongue. He walked slowly, feeling the gentle incline beneath his feet, listening to the soft hum of life surrounding him. As the day progressed, the light shifted, shadows stretching and contracting across the ground. Ares paused to watch a small stream ripple over smooth stones, listening to the sound of water threading through the valley. He knelt, letting his hands touch the cool liquid, and felt a quiet satisfaction in the simple connection between himself and the world around him. Somewhere in the distance, a deer stepped carefully through the undergrowth, its movements precise and aware. Ares crouched, observing its delicate navigation, and felt a subtle kinship with the creature's attentiveness. When it disappeared into the trees, he rose and continued along the path, each step measured, aware of textures beneath his feet, sound above, and the rhythm of wind brushing across leaves. The forest began to thin as he approached the edge of the valley, sunlight spilling over the horizon in warm, golden hues. Ares paused to run his hand along the trunk of a lone oak, its bark rough and strong, roots gripping the earth beneath. He felt the slow pulse of growth, the quiet energy that held the tree steady against wind and rain. He stepped forward, following the narrowing trail as the sun dipped lower, painting the world in soft shades of gold and rose. Somewhere nearby, a brook chuckled over stones, birds flitted from branch to branch, and the faint rustle of leaves marked the steady rhythm of the forest. Ares walked with careful attention, senses attuned, aware of every movement, every subtle change in light, scent, and sound. The path led him to a gentle rise, where he paused, feeling the breeze sweep across his face. Shadows stretched long and soft across the meadow below, and Ares imagined the quiet movements of creatures hidden among the grasses and trees. He inhaled deeply, tasting the warmth of sunlight, the faint scent of pine, and the earthy aroma of the valley floor. With deliberate steps, he began to descend toward the meadow, feeling the gentle pulse of life around him, aware of the subtle harmonies that shaped every movement. The wind whispered across grass, water rippled over stones, and Ares walked forward, each step grounding him in the quiet, steady rhythm of the world. The air was warm now, sunlight streaming through the leaves, scattering soft golden patches across the ground. Ares moved carefully along a narrow path, noticing how the forest floor gave slightly beneath his sandals. Moss clung to stones, soft and springy, and he bent to run his fingers across it, feeling the gentle resistance and the faint dampness beneath his touch. Somewhere above, a hawk called softly, wings slicing the wind in smooth arcs. A sudden flicker of movement drew his eyes to a small stream, where minnows darted beneath the water, silver flashes slipping between shadow and light. Ares crouched, letting his hands skim the surface, watching their tiny bodies pivot and turn. The cool touch of the water spread across his palms, and he felt a quiet fascination in the precision of their movements. From the edge of the stream, a narrow trail led him deeper into the forest. He followed it, careful to avoid roots that twisted across the path and stones that jutted unexpectedly. The scent of pine and damp earth filled his nose, mingling with faint traces of wildflowers tucked into shadowed corners. His eyes traced the way sunlight fell in patterns through branches, painting patches of warmth on the ground. A rustle nearby made him pause. From behind a fallen log, a family of rabbits emerged, ears upright and eyes bright. They moved delicately, noses twitching, alert to every sound. Aries crouched low, matching their careful rhythm, fascinated by their attentiveness. One of the younger rabbits hopped forward and paused, as if measuring his presence. Aries held still, feeling a subtle connection in that quiet awareness, before the rabbit bounded into the undergrowth. He continued along the trail, noticing subtle details, the curl of a fern frond, the faint glimmer of dew on a spider's web, the way a dragonfly hovered for a moment, then disappeared into the light. Each movement seemed to have its own rhythm, its own pulse, and Aries felt the forest's quiet heartbeat in every step he took. The path widened into a gentle clearing, sunlight spilling over soft grasses. Aries walked among them, brushing leaves with his fingertips, feeling their delicate resistance and faint warmth. The air carried the scent of earth and pine, mingled with the subtle sweetness of hidden blooms. He knelt to examine a cluster of tiny flowers, tracing their petals with careful fingers, feeling the slight roughness at the edges and the softness of the center. A brook curved through the clearing, its water glinting in the sunlight. Aries knelt at its edge, letting the liquid slip through his hands, cool and smooth. Tiny pebbles shifted beneath the surface, creating faint ripples that reflected the sun in scattered patterns. He traced the edges of the stones with his fingers, noting their shapes and textures, feeling the subtle pulse of the water as it meandered further into the forest. Nearby, a small deer stepped delicately from the shade, ears alert. Its movements were careful, precise, each hoof falling lightly on the ground. Aries crouched lower, watching the subtle rise and fall of its chest, the flick of its tail. The deer's gaze met him for a brief instant, a silent acknowledgement of his presence, before it moved gracefully into the deeper forest. Aries rose and followed a faint incline that led toward a ridge. The soil beneath his feet shifted from soft moss to rough stones, and he navigated carefully, feeling the textures beneath his hands when he braced against the rocks. The wind picked up, brushing softly against his face and carrying the faint scent of distant blooms and wet earth. He tilted his head, listening to the whispers of the forest, the hum of bees, the rustle of leaves, the distant murmur of a hidden stream. At the top of the ridge, he paused. Below stretched a patchwork of forest and meadow, sunlight and shadow blending in delicate patterns. The peaks of Olympus shimmered faintly beyond the hills, white marble catching the light. Aries let his fingers brush against the rough bark of a nearby oak, feeling the slow pulse of its life, and a subtle excitement stirred within him, not of urgency, but of anticipation for the experiences that lay beyond this quiet moment. The ridge sloped downward toward a shaded grove. Aries descended carefully, each footfall measured, aware of the shift in light and texture beneath his feet. The breeze carried the faint scent of pine resin and wet stone, mingled with the delicate perfume of wildflowers tucked into shadowed corners. He noticed the small details, the curve of a branch, the ripple of water over stones, the glint of sunlight on a dragonfly's wings. A soft rustle drew his attention. A fox emerged from the undergrowth, its fur catching the sunlight in soft, warm tones. Aries crouched, observing its careful movements. The fox paused, ears twitching, before darting into the shadows. Aries traced its paw prints briefly with his fingers, noting the delicate impressions left in the soft soil. The path led to a small pond, sunlight gleaming on the still water. Aries knelt at the edge, watching the gentle ripples caused by a breeze. A dragonfly skimmed the surface, wings catching the sun, then rose and disappeared into the trees. He dipped his hands into the cool water, feeling the smooth liquid slip through his fingers. The scent of wet stone and moss filled his senses, grounding him in the moment. Aries noticed a line of flowers along the bank, their colors vivid against the soft green grass. He crouched, letting his fingers brush the petals, feeling their delicate textures and subtle warmth. A faint rustle of leaves made him look up. A bird hopped along a branch, tilting its head curiously. He watched as it flitted from limb to limb, each movement careful, precise, and quiet. The sun shifted, casting long shadows across the pond. Ares rose, brushing his tunic against the soft grass, and began to follow the path that led along the edge of the water. He felt the gentle incline beneath his feet, the cool breeze against his skin, the soft pulse of life moving quietly through every leaf, stone, and ripple of water. As the day moved forward, Ares walked through the grove, careful to notice each subtle sound, the distant murmur of a stream, the flutter of wings, the rustle of small creatures moving among leaves. The forest seemed to breathe with him, every movement and sound weaving a quiet, steady rhythm that he could follow with patience and care. He paused near a clump of ferns, letting his hands glide across the leaves, noticing their delicate veins and soft texture. The air carried the scent of earth, pine, and distant blooms. He inhaled slowly, letting the fragrances settle into him, feeling the pulse of the forest in each breath. Ares stepped lightly toward a gentle slope that led to the edge of the valley. The sunlight filtered through branches, casting warm, moving patterns on the ground. He felt the texture of soft grass beneath his sandals, the rough bark of trees brushing against his fingertips, and the faint coolness of shade as he passed beneath towering oaks and pines. The wind shifted, carrying faint scents of distant water and flowers. Somewhere nearby, a deer moved quietly through the undergrowth. Ares crouched, observing its careful steps, the slight rise and fall of its chest, the twitch of ears and tail. When it disappeared into the trees, he rose, following the narrow trail that wound along the edge of the valley. Shadows lengthened as the sun dipped lower. Ares paused at the crest of the slope, feeling the soft wind brush across his face. Below, the valley stretched wide, dotted with pools of sunlight and patches of shadow. He inhaled deeply, tasting the warmth of the sun, the faint sweetness of flowers, the earthy scent of soil and stone. His steps carried him gently forward, through soft grass, beneath tall trees, alongside the faint murmur of hidden water. Every movement felt deliberate, every sensation rich and present. The forest seemed to whisper quietly, each leaf, stone, and creature contributing to a steady, harmonious rhythm. Ares followed the trail, step by step, aware of every sound, touch, and movement, letting the calm, quiet pulse of the world guide him deeper into the valley. Ares stepped carefully along the edge of the valley, feeling the soft grass bend under his sandals. Sunlight spilled in gentle patches through the canopy of tall trees, the warmth brushing against his shoulders. He tilted his head to listen, hearing the faint murmur of a distant brook and the occasional rustle of leaves stirred by hidden creatures. A flutter of wings drew his gaze upward. A small hawk wheeled above, circling with smooth, precise movements. Its shadow passed over him, brief and fleeting, and Ares lifted his hands slightly, as if tracing the bird's flight through the air. He imagined the currents it felt, the gentle lift of wind beneath its wings, and felt a quiet admiration for the effortless grace. The trail narrowed, winding past clusters of wildflowers, their colors vivid against the soft green of the valley floor. Ares crouched briefly, letting his fingers glide across petals, noting the texture of each. Tiny insects crawled across the blooms, careful and deliberate in their movements. He watched for a moment, sensing the quiet order of their small world. A rustle in the underbrush drew his attention. From behind a thicket, a young stag emerged, antlers still small, legs cautious. Its ears twitched as it stepped softly on the earth, and Ares crouched slightly to remain still. The stag's dark eyes met him for a heartbeat, and Ares felt a subtle recognition of patience, of awareness, in those wide, observing eyes. It stepped forward carefully, pausing at the edge of a sunlit patch before turning and disappearing into the shadows. Ares followed the slope upward, careful to find secure footing among roots and stones. The forest changed subtly as he climbed. The air grew cooler, carrying faint scents of pine resin and damp stone. He brushed his palm along a tree trunk, rough and solid beneath his touch, imagining the centuries it had endured, winds and storms bending and shaping its form. A small stream appeared along the path, water glittering as it twisted over smooth stones. Ares knelt, letting his hands dip into the cool current. Tiny fish darted beneath the surface, silver flashes slipping between shadow and light. He traced the shapes of stones with his fingertips, feeling the gentle current move over his palms. A soft breeze carried the faint perfume of distant blooms, blending with the earthy scent of wet soil. From the other side of the stream, movement caught his eye. A figure stood among the trees, tall and graceful, shimmering faintly in the sunlight. Ares paused, heart steady but attentive, observing the presence with careful curiosity. The figure tilted its head slightly, observing him with quiet eyes. Ares stepped forward slowly, feeling the gentle incline of the ground beneath his feet. The figure moved slightly, letting sunlight fall on delicate features, eyes reflecting the forest around them. Ares felt a subtle warmth at the sight, a gentle recognition of another being attuned to the quiet rhythm of the world. The figure spoke, voice low and soft, blending with the rustle of leaves and distant murmurs of water. Words were few, measured, each one deliberate. Ares responded with careful attention, his own voice steady and calm, carrying the quiet curiosity that had guided his steps through the valley. They walked together along the stream, noticing details that might have been overlooked alone. Small stones, delicate flowers, the faint shimmer of sunlight on moving water, all became part of the shared rhythm of their steps. Ares observed the gentle sway of the figure's movements, the way they paused to touch a leaf, trace the edge of a stone, or tilt their head toward the distant sound of birds. A soft breeze stirred, carrying scents of earth and pine, and Ares felt it brushing across his face. He inhaled slowly, letting the air fill him, feeling the pulse of life in the valley and the subtle presence beside him. Sunlight shifted across the forest floor, painting warm patterns on moss and stone, and he paused to notice the interplay of shadow and light. The figure bent to examine a cluster of ferns, brushing leaves gently between their fingers. Ares crouched beside them, tracing the veins of the fronds, noting the delicate textures and slight movements in the air. Small insects crawled along stems and petals, unbothered by their presence, each in quiet pursuit of its own task. A soft rustle drew their gaze to a fox emerging from underbrush. It paused, ears twitching, before stepping carefully along the path. Ares crouched, watching the subtle rise and fall of its chest, the careful placement of each paw. The figure beside him smiled faintly, tilting their head in quiet observation. When the fox disappeared into the shadows, Ares felt the shared understanding of the forest's gentle order. They continued along the trail, walking in deliberate harmony. Ares noticed textures beneath his hands, rough bark, smooth stones, soft moss. Sounds reached him from every direction, distant streams, bird calls, rustling leaves, the faint hum of insects. Each sensation settled in him, gentle and steady, the forest alive with quiet rhythm. Ares tilted his head, listening to the faint murmur of water over stones. He knelt to dip his hands in the stream once more, feeling the cool liquid slip over his skin. The figure beside him did the same, fingers brushing the surface, creating small ripples that caught the sunlight. The simple action was quiet, shared, an unspoken recognition of connection to the living world around them. The path rose toward a gentle hill, and they climbed slowly, feet brushing over roots and soft soil. Sunlight shifted, casting long, warm shadows across the ground. Ares noticed the subtle textures of grass and stone beneath his sandals, the faint scent of pine resin carried on the wind. Each step was deliberate, mindful, a steady rhythm that moved through him as much as through the valley. At the crest of the hill, the valley stretched wide below, rivers glinting like silver threads among the trees. Sunlight scattered across distant meadows, highlighting flowers and stones alike. Ares breathed deeply, feeling the wind brush against his skin, the warmth of the sun on his shoulders, the subtle pulse of life moving quietly through the valley. The figure paused beside him, eyes on the horizon. Ares felt the shared calm, the quiet anticipation of the journey ahead. The wind stirred again, carrying the faint fragrance of blooms and earth, and they began to descend together, step by careful step, through grass, stone, and shadowed grove. Every movement was deliberate, every sound, touch, and sight held steady attention. Ares noticed the ripple of water over pebbles, the shimmer of sunlight on leaves, the faint patterns of insects tracing paths across moss. The valley seemed to breathe with them, each moment quiet, rhythmic, and full of subtle life. Shadows lengthened as they reached the lower glade, sunlight softening into gentle gold. Ares touched the bark of a nearby tree, rough beneath his fingertips, and felt the steady pulse of life within. The figure moved beside him, brushing leaves and tracing petals with delicate care. Step by step, they continued along the path, aware of every detail, letting the calm rhythm of the valley guide them forward. Ares stepped over a cluster of roots, soft moss brushing against his sandals. The morning air carried the faint scent of wet earth and pine. He inhaled deeply, letting the cool freshness settle along his chest. A thin trail of mist curled along the ground, brushing the tops of flowers and leaves. A flicker of movement drew his attention. A rabbit hopped cautiously between ferns, pausing with ears upright. Ares crouched low, watching the delicate rhythm of its steps, the tiny rise and fall of its body as it sniffed the air. The creature darted into the underbrush, leaving faint footprints pressed into the soft soil. He traced them briefly with a finger, noticing the gentle indentation left by each paw. The forest thickened. Branches overhead wove a lattice of shadow and sunlight across his path. Ares ran his hand along a tree trunk, rough beneath his fingers, grooves catching the light. A bird called from above, a faint trill that echoed between trunks. He lifted his eyes, following its flight for a heartbeat before it disappeared into the canopy. A narrow stream cut across the path. The water glimmered over stones, smooth and worn. Ares knelt and cupped the cool liquid in his hands. Tiny fish darted beneath the surface, silver flashes slipping between shadows. He let the water trickle through his fingers, watching how it bent around his palms and scattered sunlight across the mossy stones. A rustle from the thicket drew his attention. A fawn emerged, its coat dappled with sunlight. Ares crouched low, observing the careful, precise steps of the young creature. Its ears twitched, eyes wide. He did not move, did not breathe too loudly, letting the fawn settle into its curiosity. After a moment, it bounded away, leaving only the faint imprint of hooves in damp earth. The path sloped upward, roots tangling with stones. Ares moved carefully, balancing on uneven ground, hands brushing against rough bark for stability. A breeze stirred, carrying faint traces of flowers and wet soil. He tilted his head, listening to the soft murmur of the forest, the trickle of water over rocks, the rustle of leaves, the faint hum of insects moving unseen. He reached a small clearing. Sunlight pooled on soft grass, bright and warm. Ares crouched to examine a cluster of wildflowers, brushing petals lightly with his fingers. The colors glimmered, violet, gold, and pale white. Tiny insects crawled over leaves and stems. He followed their movement with careful attention, tracing their deliberate, quiet paths. A ripple of sound drew his gaze to a shallow pond nearby. The surface reflected the light, rippling gently with a breeze. Ares knelt, letting his hands touch the water. Cool liquid ran over his fingers, slipping smoothly between the gaps. A small dragonfly skimmed the surface, wings catching the sunlight, before darting toward reeds at the edge. Ares rose and followed the pond's edge. The ground sloped gently, grass brushing against his legs. Somewhere in the distance, deer stepped carefully from shade into sunlight. Its movements were deliberate, measured. He crouched, watching the rise and fall of its chest, the twitch of its tail and ears, each motion precise. The deer paused, eyes meeting him for a fraction of a moment, before vanishing between trees. The air grew warmer as the sun climbed higher. Ares felt it brushing across his shoulders, warming his skin. He brushed leaves aside from the path, soft twigs breaking gently beneath his sandals. The forest hummed with small sounds, insects moving across leaves, distant water trickling over stones, the soft call of a hidden bird. Ares followed the trail upward, toward a ridge that offered a view of the valley below. Sunlight scattered across meadows, streams glinting like silver threads. He stopped, letting the wind brush across his face. Fingers ran along the rough bark of a nearby tree, tracing grooves and knots, feeling the slow pulse of life contained in solid wood. He crouched to examine a patch of flowers near the ridge. Tiny petals glimmered in the sun. A soft breeze stirred, carrying the faint perfume of earth and blossoms. A fox appeared at the edge of the trees, fur warm in the light, tail flicking. Ares crouched low, watching its careful, precise steps. The fox paused briefly, sniffed the air, and disappeared into the shadows. The path led downward, through soft grass and scattered stones. He moved slowly, noticing textures beneath his hands and feet. The moss, rough bark, the smooth edges of stones, the slight coolness of shadowed ground. A distant stream gurgled, its steady murmur blending with the rustle of leaves. Ares crouched at the water, letting his hands dip into the cool liquid. Tiny ripples spread across the surface. Sunlight fractured on the water, glittering against moss-covered stones. He breathed slowly, taking in the faint scent of flowers, earth, and pine resin carried by the wind. From the underbrush, he noticed movement. A pair of birds flitted between branches, their wings brushing leaves softly. He tilted his head, following their arcs. A small rabbit hopped past, ears alert, disappearing into shade. Ares remained still, tracing the subtle patterns of life around him, each movement deliberate, each sound carefully observed. The trail curved gently, leading toward a grove where sunlight filtered through tall trees. The forest hummed with quiet energy. Insects traced delicate paths, water trickled over stones, leaves whispered in the breeze. Ares stepped carefully, feeling the soft incline beneath his sandals, brushing past ferns and grasses, letting each moment of the forest fill him with awareness. He paused at the crest of a small hill. Shadows stretched long across the valley, sunlight warming his shoulders. Below, streams shimmered, and distant trees swayed gently. Ares inhaled the scents of pine, earth, and faint blossoms, letting each layer settle in him. The forest around him moved quietly, alive with rhythm and texture. Step by step, he descended toward the meadow below, aware of every touch, every sound, every flicker of movement. Small creatures scurried through grasses, water rippled over stones, and birds flitted across branches. He brushed his fingers along leaves and stone, tracing patterns, textures, and gentle curves. The sun dipped lower, casting soft gold across the forest. Ares continued along the valley path. The ground alternated between soft moss and scattered stones. Each step required attention. Some roots stretched across the path, forcing him to lift his feet higher than usual. He ran his hand over the rough bark of a tree to maintain balance. The bark was firm and uneven, scraping slightly against his fingers. He paused near a cluster of ferns. Their long fronds bent under his touch. Small insects crawled along the stems. Ares leaned closer to observe them, noticing the segmented bodies and the way their legs moved in sequence. He remained still until they moved past. A faint rustle indicated a small animal moving deeper in the ferns. He watched carefully until it disappeared from sight. The path narrowed as it followed a shallow stream. The water moved over smooth stones and created small ripples. Ares knelt and let his hands enter the stream. The water was cold, moving steadily around his fingers. Tiny fish darted between stones. He watched their movement, noting the quick turns and small, precise motions. He lifted his hands, letting the water run through his fingers, and replaced them to feel the current again. A rustle behind a tree made him turn. A fox appeared, fur red-brown and thick. It stopped and sniffed the air. Ares crouched and observed its movements. The fox's paws touched the ground lightly. It raised its head, ears twitching, and looked directly at him. Ares held still, maintaining distance. The fox turned and ran into the underbrush, leaving faint paw prints on the moist soil. He examined the tracks, noticing their depth and spacing, and followed the path carefully. The slope of the path increased. Roots and small stones made footing uneven. Ares climbed slowly, placing each foot deliberately. One hand rested on a tree trunk. The rough bark scratched lightly against his palm. A breeze passed through, carrying the scent of pine resin and damp soil. He inhaled steadily, noting the mixture of scents. Above, leaves moved with the wind, creating small noises as they brushed against one another. A small clearing appeared. Sunlight covered soft grass. Ares crouched and inspected wildflowers. Their petals were violet, yellow, and pale white. He touched them lightly, feeling the thin texture and smooth edges. Insects moved over the petals. He observed their legs and wings, following each movement until they flew away. He moved toward a pond. The water was still on the surface. A dragonfly skimmed across and landed on a reed. Ares crouched, putting his hands into the water. It felt cold, smooth, and solid against his palms. Small ripples spread outward from his hands. Stones under the surface shifted slightly, moving with the water's flow. He watched a small fish swim near his fingers, turning sharply around the stone. The path rose gently on the other side of the pond. Grass brushed against his legs as he walked. The slope became steeper, and small stones caused him to adjust his footing. He noticed a rabbit moving cautiously along the path. Its ears twitched. It stopped and sniffed the ground. Aries crouched, staying still as it moved on. A hill led to the edge of the valley. From the top, he observed streams cutting through the meadows below. Trees moved slightly in the wind. He placed his hand on the bark of a nearby oak. The surface was rough and firm. He pressed his fingers against a knot in the wood, feeling the hardness. The wind carried scents of pine and wet soil. A fox appeared again at the edge of the forest. It moved slowly, tail flicking once. Aries watched it carefully until it vanished into the trees. The path descended toward a meadow covered in flowers. Aries crouched to touch each one. Their petals were thin, edges slightly rough. Bees moved between the flowers, wings vibrating rapidly. He followed their movements with his eyes, noticing each landing and takeoff. A small stream ran through the meadow. Aries knelt and placed his hands in the water. The current was steady, cold, and smooth. Small stones shifted beneath his fingers. Water droplets ran along his arms. He observed small fish moving over the stones, darting quickly in short bursts. The path continued along the edge of the meadow. Grass pressed against his legs. Flowers bent under his fingers as he walked past them. Birds moved from branch to branch, stopping occasionally to peck at seeds or insects. A rabbit ran across the path, disappearing into underbrush. Aries stepped carefully over exposed roots and small rocks. The sun began to lower, casting longer shadows across the ground. He noted changes in the light. Shadows stretched across the grass and rocks. The texture of the soil became more visible in the fading sunlight. Aries slowed his pace, observing every movement of creatures around him. Insects moved along leaves. Birds called softly to one another. Small animals shifted in the underbrush. A hill led to a shallow ridge. Aries climbed carefully, pressing hands against tree trunks for support. Stones shifted slightly under his feet. He observed the slope, calculating each step before moving. At the top, he saw streams, meadows, and trees stretching below. He moved down the slope into the valley, watching shadows lengthen across the grass and soil. The path led him past ferns and small clusters of flowers. Aries bent down to inspect leaves and petals. Insects moved across them. He touched stones and tree bark along the trail, noting the rough and smooth textures. A small stream flowed nearby. He placed his hands in the water, feeling the cool movement over his skin. Aries continued along the path through the meadow, stepping carefully to avoid roots and stones. He watched birds fly between trees and small animals move through the grass. The wind shifted occasionally, bringing the scent of pine, wet soil, and flowers. He adjusted his footing as the terrain changed from soft soil to scattered stones and moss. By the time the sun reached mid-afternoon, Aries reached a broader clearing. Streams crossed the ground in small, shallow channels. The grass grew thick and soft. Aries crouched and examined stones, moss, and small plants along the trail. Each leaf, stone, and insect received attention as he moved forward. Aries moved carefully along the edge of the clearing. The grass was uneven, soft in some areas, firm in others. Small stones were scattered along the path. He stepped over them, adjusting his balance when the ground tilted slightly beneath his sandals. A group of ferns grew near the edge of the clearing. He crouched and touched their leaves. They were thin and slightly damp from the morning mist. Small insects crawled along the stems. He noticed their segmented bodies and the way each leg moved in order. One crawled over a leaf, paused, then moved toward the ground. Aries followed its movement with his eyes until it disappeared into the soil. The path led him to a narrow stream. Water moved steadily over stones that were smooth and worn. Aries knelt and placed his hands into the stream. The water was cold against his skin. Tiny fish swam near his fingers, turning sharply around stones and each other. He lifted his hands, letting the water flow through his fingers, and replaced them to feel the current again. A rustle came from the underbrush. A small deer stepped into view. Its legs were thin, movements careful. Aries crouched, observing the rise and fall of its chest. The deer's ears twitched as it listened. Its dark eyes met him for a brief moment, then it stepped back into the shade of the trees. He noted the faint paw prints left behind in the soft soil. The trail climbed slightly. Roots and stones made the path uneven. Aries adjusted his steps, pressing his hands against tree trunks for stability. The bark was rough and firm. He noticed small grooves and knots along the surface. The wind passed through the trees, carrying scents of pine and damp earth. Leaves moved, creating soft sounds as they rubbed together. A small clearing appeared ahead. Sunlight reached the grass. Aries crouched and examined flowers scattered across the clearing. The petals were various colors, white, yellow, and violet. He touched them lightly, feeling the texture. Bees moved between the flowers, collecting nectar. He watched the small movements of their legs and wings until they flew away. A pond appeared near the center of the clearing. The water was calm. A dragonfly skimmed the surface and rested on a reed. Aries knelt and placed his hands in the water. It felt cold and smooth. Small ripples moved outward from his hands. Stones shifted slightly under the water. Small fish swam near the edges of the pond. The path sloped upward from the pond. Grass brushed against his legs. He stepped over small roots and stones carefully. The slope became steeper. Aries placed one hand on a tree trunk to maintain balance. The bark scraped lightly against his palm. A fox appeared along the edge of the trees. Its fur was red-brown. It paused, ears moving, tail flicking once. Aries stayed still and observed it. The fox ran into the underbrush. He looked at its faint paw prints in the soil and continued along the path. The trail led to a hill. Streams and meadows stretched below. Trees moved slightly as wind passed through. Aries touched the bark of a nearby tree, feeling the rough surface and a knot where the trunk had grown irregularly. Small stones pressed under his sandals as he stepped forward. The hill sloped down toward a meadow. Grass covered the ground, firm but soft. Flowers grew in small clusters. Aries crouched to touch them, noticing the thin petals and their smooth surfaces. Insects moved along the flowers. Bees landed briefly before flying away. A small stream ran across the meadow. Aries knelt and put his hands in the water. It felt cold, flowing steadily over small stones. The stones shifted slightly as the water ran over them. Tiny fish darted beneath the surface. He lifted his hands and placed them back into the stream, observing how the current moved around his fingers. The path continued along the edge of the meadow. Grass pressed against his legs. Flowers bent lightly as he passed. Birds flew between the trees, stopping to peck at seeds. A rabbit moved quickly through the grass, disappearing into underbrush. Aries adjusted his steps to avoid roots and stones. The sun lowered slightly, casting longer shadows across the meadow. The texture of soil, grass, and stone became more visible. Aries slowed his pace, keeping attention on the trail. Leaves moved above him. Birds called softly from branches. Small animals shifted in the underbrush. The trail led to a gentle slope. He climbed slowly, pressing hands on tree trunks when necessary. Stones shifted under his sandals. He watched the incline carefully. At the top, he could see streams and meadows stretching across the valley. He stepped down the slope, observing shadows across the grass and soil. The path moved through patches of ferns and small flowers. Aries crouched to inspect leaves and petals. Insects moved along them. A small stream ran nearby. He placed his hands in the water, feeling it flow over his skin. Stones under the surface shifted slightly. He followed the path through the meadow. Birds flew between trees. Small animals moved along the grass. Wind shifted occasionally, carrying scents of pine, soil, and flowers. The terrain changed under his feet from soft soil to stones and patches of moss. By mid-afternoon, Aries reached a wider clearing. Streams crossed small channels of earth. The grass was thick and firm. Aries crouched to observe stones, moss, and plants along the trail. Aries moved along the edge of the clearing. The grass was firm beneath his sandals, though small patches of soft moss made his steps uneven. He lifted his feet carefully over stones and exposed roots. His hand brushed against the rough bark of a nearby tree to maintain balance. A cluster of ferns grew beside the path. He crouched and ran his fingers along the leaves. The texture was slightly rough with small veins, and water droplets clung to the edges. Tiny insects crawled along the stems. Aries watched their movements until they disappeared into the soil. A narrow stream appeared ahead. Water flowed over stones, smooth and polished for movement. Aries knelt and placed his hands in the stream. It felt cold. Small fish swam near his fingers, moving quickly around stones and each other. He lifted his hands and watched the water ripple, then placed them back to observe again. A rustle in the underbrush drew his attention. A young deer emerged. Its legs were thin and careful as it moved. Aries crouched and observed the rise and fall of its chest. Its ears twitched at every small sound. The deer looked at him for a moment and then moved back into the shade of the trees. Aries noticed its faint paw prints in the soft soil. The trail became steeper. Roots and stones required careful placement of his feet. Aries pressed one hand against the bark of a tree for support. The bark was firm and rough, with small grooves. A slight breeze moved through the trees, carrying the scent of pine and wet soil. The leaves above rustled softly. A clearing opened ahead. Sunlight reached patches of grass. Aries crouched and examined flowers scattered across the ground. Petals were yellow, white, and violet. He touched them, feeling their smooth texture. Insects crawled on the petals and stems, moving with precise measured steps. He observed their movement until they flew away. A pond appeared nearby. The water was still on the surface. A dragonfly skimmed the surface and landed on a reed. Aries knelt and placed his hands in the water. It felt cool and smooth. Small ripples spread from his hands. Stones under the water shifted slightly. Fish swam near the edges. The path rose gently from the pond. Grass brushed against his legs. He stepped over roots and stones, adjusting footing as the incline increased. He held one hand on a tree trunk for balance. Bark pressed against his palm, rough and firm. A fox appeared at the edge of the trees. Its fur was reddish-brown. It paused, ears moving, tail flicking once, before disappearing into the forest. Aries looked at its faint paw prints in the soil and continued along the trail. The slope led to a small hill. From the top, he could see streams running through meadows below. Trees moved slightly as wind passed through. Aries touched the bark of an oak. The surface was rough and solid. Small stones shifted beneath his sandals as he stepped forward. The trail descended toward a meadow. Grass covered the ground. Aries crouched to touch flowers, noticing the thin petals and smooth surfaces. Insects moved across the plants. Bees landed briefly before flying away. A small stream ran across the meadow. Aries knelt and placed his hands in the water. The current was steady and cold. Small stones shifted under his fingers. Fish darted beneath the surface. He repeated this several times, observing the water flow and the movement of the fish. The path continued along the edge of the meadow. Grass pressed against his legs. Flowers bent lightly as he walked past. Birds flew between trees, stopping occasionally to peck at seeds or insects. A rabbit ran across the path and disappeared into the underbrush. Aries stepped carefully over roots and stones. Sunlight began to shift, casting longer shadows. Aries noticed changes in the texture of soil, grass, and stone as the light moved. He slowed his pace slightly, observing small movements around him. Leaves rustled above. Birds called softly. Small animals moved in the underbrush. The trail led to a gentle slope. Aries climbed slowly, pressing his hands on tree trunks when necessary. Stones shifted under his feet. He examined the incline, moving deliberately. At the top, streams and meadows stretched across the valley. He moved down the slope, noting shadows across the grass and soil. The path led through ferns and clusters of flowers. Aries crouched to inspect the leaves and petals. Insects moved across them. A small stream ran nearby. He placed his hands in the water, feeling the current and watching small fish swim. Stones shifted under the water. He continued along the path through the meadow. Birds flew between trees. Small animals moved along the grass. The wind shifted occasionally, carrying scents of pine, soil, and flowers. The terrain alternated between soft soil, scattered stones, and moss. By mid-afternoon, Aries reached a wider clearing. Streams ran across shallow channels. The grass was thick and firm. Aries crouched and examined stones, moss, and small plants along the trail. He moved forward carefully, noting each leaf, stone, and insect in his path. A movement at the edge of the clearing drew his attention. A small group of birds took flight from the trees. Aries watched them until they disappeared from sight. He adjusted his steps as the path led toward another shallow stream. Water flowed over stones, cool against his hands. Small fish moved in patterns around the stones. Aries followed the stream to a patch of grass slightly higher than the surrounding meadow. Small flowers dotted the area. He crouched, examining petals, leaves, and the insects moving along them. Sunlight reached the grass, warming it. The path curved slightly as it led into a denser forest. He stepped into the trees. Roots and stones made footing uneven. Aries moved cautiously, placing hands on trunks for support. Leaves rustled above. Birds moved quickly from branch to branch. A rabbit ran along the edge of the path, disappearing into the underbrush. The forest floor rose gradually, leading to a small hill. Aries climbed carefully, feeling the texture of bark and stone under his hands and feet. At the top, he paused briefly to note the streams and meadows below. The path continued down the slope, shaded by trees. Aries moved forward, adjusting his steps to avoid loose stones and roots. Aries moved along the trail that led into a thicker section of the forest. The ground was uneven. Patches of soft moss alternated with hard soil and scattered stones. He lifted each foot carefully to avoid slipping or tripping. Roots crossed the path, some large and protruding. He pressed his hand against a tree trunk to maintain balance. The bark was rough and solid. Small ferns grew beside the trail. Aries crouched and touched their leaves. Water droplets clung to the edges. Tiny insects crawled along the stems. He watched their movements, noting the way each leg moved in sequence. One insect paused before continuing along the leaf toward the ground. A thin stream ran parallel to the trail. Water moved over smooth stones. Aries knelt and put his hands into the stream. It was cold and steady. Small fish swam around his fingers, turning sharply as they passed stones. He lifted his hands and watched ripples spread across the surface. Then he placed them back in the water to feel the current again. A rustling sound came from the underbrush. A young deer emerged, cautious and alert. Its legs were thin and careful with each step. Aries crouched, watching the rise and fall of its chest. The deer's ears moved continuously, listening for any sound. Its dark eyes met his briefly before it retreated into the shade of the trees. He observed its faint paw prints left in the soft soil. The trail began to slope upward. Roots and small stones forced careful steps. Aries pressed one hand on a nearby tree trunk for support. The bark was firm and rough, with knots and grooves. A slight breeze passed, carrying the scent of pine and damp earth. Leaves above moved, producing soft sounds as they brushed together. A clearing opened ahead. Sunlight reached patches of grass. Aries crouched and examined the flowers scattered across the ground. Petals were white, yellow, and violet. He touched them, noting the texture. Insects crawled along the leaves and petals, moving with precise steps. A few bees landed briefly before flying away. A pond appeared nearby. Its surface was calm. A dragonfly skimmed across and landed on a reed. Aries knelt and placed his hands in the water. It felt cold and smooth. Small ripples moved outward from his hands. Stones under the surface shifted slightly. Small fish swam near the edges. The path rose gradually from the pond. Grass brushed against his legs. He stepped over roots and small stones. The slope increased. One hand rested against a tree trunk for balance. The bark pressed against his palm. A fox appeared at the edge of the trees. Its red-brown fur glimmered in the sunlight. It paused, ears moving, tail flicking once. Ares remained still, observing it until it disappeared into the forest. He examined its faint paw prints and continued along the trail. The slope led to a small hill. From the top, he could see streams and meadows below. Trees moved slightly as the wind passed through them. Ares touched the bark of an oak tree, feeling the rough texture. Small stones shifted under his sandals as he stepped forward. The trail descended toward a meadow. Grass covered the ground. Ares crouched to touch flowers, noting the thin petals and smooth surfaces. Insects moved along the plants. Bees landed briefly before flying away. A small stream ran across the meadow. Ares knelt and placed his hands in the water. The current was cold and steady. Small stones shifted beneath his fingers. Fish darted beneath the surface. He repeated this process several times, observing how the water flowed around stones and fish. The path continued along the edge of the meadow. Grass pressed against his legs. Flowers bent lightly as he stepped past them. Birds flew between trees, stopping occasionally to peck at seeds or insects. A rabbit ran across the path, disappearing into the underbrush. Ares stepped carefully over roots and stones. Sunlight began to shift, casting longer shadows across the meadow. Ares noticed changes in the texture of soil, grass, and stone as the light changed. He slowed his pace slightly, paying attention to small movements around him. Leaves moved above. Birds called softly from branches. Small animals moved in the underbrush. The trail led to a gentle slope. Ares climbed slowly, pressing hands on tree trunks when necessary. Stones shifted under his feet. He observed the incline carefully before stepping. At the top, streams and meadows stretched across the valley. He stepped down the slope, noticing shadows across the grass and soil. The path passed through clusters of ferns and small flowers. Ares crouched to inspect leaves and petals. Insects moved across them. A small stream ran nearby. He placed his hands in the water, feeling the current move over his skin. Stones beneath the surface shifted slightly. He continued along the trail through the meadow. Birds flew between trees. Small animals moved across the grass. The wind shifted occasionally, carrying the scent of pine, soil, and flowers. The terrain changed under his feet, alternating between soft soil, scattered stones, and moss. By late afternoon, Ares reached a wider clearing. Streams ran across shallow channels. The grass was thick and firm. He crouched and examined stones, moss, and small plants along the trail. Every leaf, insect, and stone received careful attention as he moved forward. At the edge of the clearing, Ares noticed faint signs of movement deeper in the forest. Branches bent slightly as if something had passed through. Leaves were disturbed along the trail. He moved closer to investigate, stepping carefully over roots and stones. A few small animals scattered into the underbrush. Ares crouched and observed a small patch of disturbed soil. It was soft and damp. Paw prints were visible. He noted the size and spacing. The marks suggested a group of creatures had passed through recently. He followed the path where the prints led, moving cautiously. The trail led into denser forest. Roots and rocks forced careful footing. Trees pressed closer together, creating shaded areas. Ares moved slowly, hands brushing against trunks and leaves for support. The sounds of the forest were constant: water in a distant stream, leaves moving, small animals rustling through underbrush. Ares continued along the narrow trail in the dense forest. The ground was uneven, covered with patches of soft moss, hard soil, and scattered stones. Roots crossed the path at irregular intervals. He lifted his feet carefully, stepping over each one. His hand brushed against the rough bark of a tree for support. A small cluster of ferns grew beside the trail. Ares crouched and ran his fingers along the leaves. Water droplets clung to the edges. Tiny insects crawled along the stems. He followed their movements until they disappeared into the soil. The trail led to a small stream. Water flowed over smooth stones. Ares knelt and placed his hands in the water. It was cold. Small fish swam near his fingers, moving quickly around stones. He lifted his hands and watched the ripples spread across the surface. Then he placed them back in the water to feel the flow again. A rustling sound came from nearby. A young deer stepped into the trail. Its legs were thin, and each step was careful. Aries crouched and watched the rise and fall of its chest. Its ears moved continuously, listening for sound. Its eyes met him briefly before it retreated into the shade of the trees. Aries noticed faint paw prints left behind in the soft soil. The trail sloped upward. Roots and stones forced careful steps. Aries pressed one hand on a nearby tree trunk for balance. The bark was firm and rough. He felt grooves and knots under his fingers. A light breeze moved through the trees, carrying the scent of pine and damp earth. Leaves brushed together, producing soft noises. The forest opened slightly into a clearing. Sunlight touched patches of grass. Aries crouched and inspected flowers scattered across the clearing. Petals were white, yellow, and violet. He touched them and noted the smooth texture. Insects crawled across the leaves and petals, moving in small, precise motions. Bees landed briefly before flying away. A pond appeared nearby. The surface was calm. A dragonfly skimmed across and landed on a reed. Aries knelt and placed his hands in the water. It was cold and smooth. Small ripples spread outward from his hands. Stones under the water shifted slightly. Fish moved near the edges of the pond. The path rose gently from the pond. Grass brushed against his legs. Roots and stones required careful steps. One hand rested on a tree trunk for balance. The bark pressed firmly against his palm. A fox appeared at the edge of the trees. Its fur was reddish-brown. It paused, ears moving, tail flicking once. Aries observed until it disappeared into the forest. He examined its faint paw prints and continued along the trail. The slope led to a small hill. From the top, he could see streams and meadows below. Trees moved slightly as the wind passed through. Aries touched the bark of an oak tree. The surface was rough. Small stones shifted under his sandals as he stepped forward. The trail descended toward a meadow. Grass covered the ground. Aries crouched to touch flowers, noting the thin petals and smooth surfaces. Insects moved along the plants. Bees landed briefly and flew away. A small stream ran across the meadow. Aries knelt and placed his hands in the water. The current was steady and cold. Stones shifted beneath his fingers. Fish swam beneath the surface. He repeated this process several times, observing water flow and fish movements. The path continued along the meadow's edge. Grass pressed against his legs. Flowers bent lightly as he walked past. Birds flew between trees, stopping occasionally to peck at seeds. A rabbit ran across the path and disappeared into the underbrush. Aries adjusted his steps over roots and stones. Sunlight shifted, casting longer shadows across the meadow. Aries noticed changes in the texture of soil, grass, and stone. He slowed his pace slightly, observing small movements around him. Leaves moved above. Birds called softly from branches. Small animals shifted in the underbrush. The trail led to a gentle slope. Aries climbed slowly, pressing hands on tree trunks when necessary. Stones shifted under his feet. He examined the incline carefully before stepping. At the top, streams and meadows stretched across the valley. He stepped down the slope, observing shadows across the grass and soil. Aries entered a denser section of the forest. Roots and rocks made footing uneven. Trees pressed closer together. He moved slowly, hands brushing against trunks and leaves for support. The sounds of the forest were constant, water in a distant stream, leaves moving, small animals rustling through the underbrush. At the edge of the clearing, Aries noticed faint signs of movement deeper in the forest. Leaves were disturbed along the trail. A few small animals scattered into the underbrush. Branches bent slightly as if something had passed through. He crouched and examined the disturbed soil. Paw prints were visible. Their size and spacing suggested a group of creatures had passed recently. Aries followed the trail of prints carefully, stepping over roots and stones. The trail led to a slope. The forest floor rose gradually. Aries climbed carefully, feeling bark and stone under his hands and feet. At the top, he paused briefly to observe the streams and meadows below. The path continued down the slope into denser shade. Aries moved forward, watching for loose stones and roots. A faint sound reached him. Leaves rustled more sharply ahead. Aries slowed, crouching slightly. Small twigs snapped under weight, indicating movement. He adjusted his path, moving quietly and observing the direction of the disturbance. Small animals ran into the underbrush, revealing the presence of something larger moving ahead. He advanced cautiously. The trail led him past clusters of ferns and small flowers. Insects moved along them. A stream ran nearby. Aries placed his hands in the water, feeling the cold current. Stones shifted slightly beneath his fingers. He lifted his hands and continued along the trail, moving carefully through the forest. Aries continued along the narrow forest trail. The ground was uneven, alternating between patches of soft moss, hard soil, and scattered stones. Roots crossed the path in multiple places. He lifted his feet carefully and adjusted his balance with each step. His hand pressed against the rough bark of a tree for support. A cluster of ferns grew beside the trail. Aries crouched and ran his fingers along the leaves. Small water droplets clung to the edges. Tiny insects crawled along the stems. He observed their movement until they disappeared into the soil. A thin stream appeared ahead. Water flowed over smooth stones. Aries knelt and placed his hands in the water. It was cold. Small fish swam near his fingers, moving quickly around stones. He lifted his hands, watching ripples spread across the surface, then placed them back to feel the current again. A rustling sound came from the underbrush. A young deer stepped into the trail. Its legs were thin and each movement careful. Aries crouched, watching the rise and fall of its chest. Its ears moved continuously. Its dark eyes met his briefly before it retreated into the shade of the trees. He noticed faint paw prints left behind in the soft soil. The trail began to slope upward. Roots and stones required deliberate steps. Aries pressed one hand against a nearby tree trunk for support. The bark was rough. A slight breeze carried the scent of pine and damp soil. The leaves above rustled softly. A clearing appeared. Sunlight reached patches of grass. Aries crouched and inspected flowers scattered across the ground. Petals were white, yellow, and violet. Insects moved along leaves and petals. Bees landed briefly before flying away. He observed the precise movements of their legs and wings. A pond appeared nearby. The surface was calm. A dragonfly skimmed across and landed on a reed. Aries knelt and placed his hands in the water. It felt cold and smooth. Small ripples spread outward. Stones shifted under the water. Fish swam near the edges. The path rose gently from the pond. Grass brushed against his legs. Roots and stones required careful steps. One hand rested on a tree trunk for support. Bark pressed firmly against his palm. A fox appeared at the edge of the trees. Its reddish-brown fur caught a brief shaft of sunlight. It paused, ears moving, tail flicking once. Aries observed it until it disappeared into the forest. He examined faint paw prints and continued along the trail. The slope led to a small hill. Streams and meadows stretched below. Trees moved slightly as the wind passed through. Aries touched the bark of an oak tree. Small stones shifted under his sandals. The trail descended toward a meadow. Grass covered the ground. Aries crouched to touch flowers, noticing thin petals and smooth surfaces. Insects moved along them. Bees landed briefly before flying away. A small stream ran across the meadow. Aries knelt and placed his hands in the water. The current was steady and cold. Stones shifted beneath his fingers. Fish swam beneath the surface. He repeated the process several times. The path continued along the meadow's edge. Grass pressed against his legs. Flowers bent lightly as he passed. Birds flew between trees. A rabbit ran across the path, disappearing into the underbrush. Aries stepped carefully over roots and stones. Sunlight shifted, casting longer shadows across the meadow. Ares slowed slightly, observing small movements around him. Leaves moved above. Birds called softly. Small animals shifted in the underbrush. The trail led to a gentle slope. Ares climbed slowly, pressing hands on tree trunks when necessary. Stones shifted under his feet. At the top, streams and meadows stretched across the valley. He stepped down the slope, observing shadows across the grass and soil. He entered a denser section of the forest. Roots and rocks made footing uneven. Trees pressed closer together. Ares moved slowly, brushing hands against trunks and leaves for support. Sounds of water, leaves, and small animals were constant. At the edge of the clearing, he noticed signs of movement deeper in the forest. Leaves were disturbed along the trail. A few small animals scattered into the underbrush. Branches bent slightly as if something had passed. Ares crouched to examine disturbed soil. Paw prints were visible. Their size and spacing suggested a group of creatures had passed recently. He followed the trail of prints carefully, stepping over roots and stones. The trail led to a slope. The forest floor rose gradually. Ares climbed carefully, feeling bark and stone under his hands and feet. At the top, he paused briefly to observe streams and meadows below. The path continued down the slope into shaded areas. A faint sound reached him. Leaves rustled more sharply ahead. Ares crouched slightly. Small twigs snapped under weight. He adjusted his path, moving quietly and observing the direction of the disturbance. Small animals ran into the underbrush, revealing the presence of something larger moving ahead. He advanced cautiously. The trail led past clusters of ferns and small flowers. Insects moved along them. A stream ran nearby. Ares placed his hands in the water, feeling the cold current. Stones shifted beneath his fingers. He lifted his hands and continued along the trail. Ares moved deeper into the forest. Shadows grew longer. Roots and stones made each step deliberate. The trail became narrower. He pressed hands against trunks for stability. The sounds of water, birds, and moving animals continued. He reached a slight clearing where the paw prints and disturbances ended. The ground was firm, covered in grass and scattered stones. Ares looked carefully at the area, noting any signs of recent movement. No animals appeared immediately. He waited briefly, observing the surroundings. A light breeze passed. Leaves rustled. A bird called from a branch. Ares continued forward along the trail, moving cautiously and deliberately through the dense forest. Ares moved slowly through the dense forest. The trail was narrow and uneven. Patches of moss alternated with hard soil and scattered stones. Roots crossed the path in multiple places. He lifted his feet carefully, adjusting his balance with each step. One hand pressed against the rough bark of a tree for stability. A group of ferns grew beside the trail. Ares crouched and ran his fingers along the leaves. Small droplets of water clung to the edges. Tiny insects crawled along the stems. He followed their movement until they disappeared into the soil. A thin stream ran parallel to the trail. Water flowed steadily over smooth stones. Ares knelt and placed his hands in the water. It felt cold. Small fish swam near his fingers, turning sharply as they moved between stones. He lifted his hands and watched the ripples spread across the surface. Then he placed them back to feel the current again. A rustling sound came from the underbrush. A young deer stepped onto the path. Its legs were thin and careful with each movement. Ares crouched and observed the rise and fall of its chest. Its ears moved continuously. Its dark eyes met his briefly before it retreated into the shade of the trees. He noted the faint paw prints left behind in the soft soil. The trail began to slope upward. Roots and stones required deliberate steps. Ares pressed one hand against a nearby tree trunk for support. The bark was rough. A breeze carried the scent of pine and damp soil. The leaves above moved softly. The forest opened slightly into a clearing. Sunlight reached patches of grass. Ares crouched and inspected flowers scattered across the ground. Petals were white, yellow, and violet. Insects moved along the leaves and petals, their movements precise. Bees landed briefly before flying away. A pond appeared nearby. The water's surface was calm. A dragonfly skimmed across and landed on a reed. Ares knelt and placed his hands in the water. It felt cold and smooth. Small ripples spread outward from his hands. Stones beneath the water shifted slightly. Fish swam near the edges. The path rose gently from the pond. Grass brushed against his legs. Roots and stones required careful steps. One hand rested against a tree trunk for support. Bark pressed firmly against his palm. A fox appeared at the edge of the trees. Its reddish-brown fur reflected sunlight. It paused, ears moving, tail flicking once. Ares observed until it disappeared into the forest. He examined the faint paw prints and continued along the trail. The slope led to a small hill. Streams and meadows stretched below. Trees moved slightly as the wind passed through. Ares touched the bark of an oak tree. Small stones shifted under his sandals. The trail descended toward a meadow. Grass covered the ground. Ares crouched to touch flowers, noticing the thin petals and smooth surfaces. Insects moved along them. Bees landed briefly and flew away. A small stream ran across the meadow. Ares knelt and placed his hands in the water. The current was steady and cold. Stones shifted beneath his fingers. Fish swam beneath the surface. He repeated the process several times, observing how the water flowed and the movement of fish. The path continued along the edge of the meadow. Grass pressed against his legs. Flowers bent lightly as he passed. Birds flew between trees. A rabbit ran across the path, disappearing into the underbrush. Ares stepped carefully over roots and stones. Sunlight shifted, casting longer shadows across the meadow. Ares noticed changes in the texture of soil, grass, and stone. He slowed his pace slightly, observing small movements around him. Leaves moved above. Birds called softly. Small animals shifted in the underbrush. The trail led to a gentle slope. Ares climbed slowly, pressing hands on tree trunks when necessary. Stones shifted under his feet. At the top, streams and meadows stretched across the valley. He stepped down the slope, observing shadows across the grass and soil. He entered a denser section of the forest. Roots and rocks made footing uneven. Trees pressed closer together. Ares moved slowly, brushing hands against trunks and leaves for support. The sounds of water, leaves, and small animals were constant. At the edge of the clearing, Ares noticed faint signs of movement deeper in the forest. Leaves were disturbed along the trail. A few small animals scattered into the underbrush. Branches bent slightly as if something had passed. Ares crouched to examine disturbed soil. Paw prints were visible. Their size and spacing suggested a group of creatures had passed recently. He followed the trail of prints carefully, stepping over roots and stones. The trail led to a slope. The forest floor rose gradually. Ares climbed carefully, feeling bark and stone under his hands and feet. At the top, he paused briefly to observe streams and meadows below. The path continued down the slope into shaded areas. A faint sound reached him. Leaves rustled more sharply ahead. Ares crouched slightly. Small twigs snapped under weight. He adjusted his path, moving quietly and observing the direction of the disturbance. Small animals ran into the underbrush, revealing the presence of something larger moving ahead. He advanced cautiously. The trail led past clusters of ferns and small flowers. Insects moved along them. A stream ran nearby. Ares placed his hands in the water, feeling the cold current. Stones shifted beneath his fingers. He lifted his hands and continued along the trail. Ares moved deeper into the forest. Shadows grew longer. Roots and stones made each step deliberate. The trail became narrower. He pressed hands against trunks for stability. The sounds of water, birds, and moving animals continued. Ahead, he noticed faint human footprints mixed with the paw prints. They were small and narrow. The prints continued deeper into the trees. Ares slowed his pace, examining each footprint carefully. The trail led to a slight clearing where light filtered through the trees. Small branches and leaves were disturbed across the ground. Ares crouched to examine them. The forest was quieter here. The movement seemed recent. Ares advanced slowly, stepping carefully over roots and stones, watching for further signs of activity. Ares moved carefully along the narrow forest trail. The trees were close together, their branches forming a low canopy. Roots and stones crossed the path at irregular intervals. He lifted his feet deliberately, stepping over each obstacle. One hand pressed against a rough tree trunk for stability. The bark scratched slightly against his palm. The air was damp. The smell of pine, wet soil, and fallen leaves filled his senses. Small droplets of water clung to the leaves above, occasionally falling to the ground with a soft plink. A light breeze moved through the branches, causing a rustling sound that echoed softly in the still forest. A narrow stream appeared on his left. Water flowed steadily over smooth stones. Ares knelt and placed his hands in the water. It was cold and smooth. Small fish swam around his fingers, darting sharply to avoid his touch. He lifted his hands and watched the ripples spread across the pond-like surface. Then he placed them back in the stream to feel the current again. A rustling came from the underbrush. A young deer stepped cautiously onto the trail. Its legs were thin and careful with each movement. Ares crouched slightly, observing the rise and fall of its chest as it breathed. Its ears twitched continuously. Its dark eyes met his briefly before it retreated into the shade of the trees. Faint paw prints were visible in the soil. He examined the spacing and depth of the tracks. The trail began to slope upward. Roots and stones required careful steps. Ares pressed one hand against a tree trunk for support. Bark under his fingers was rough and solid. A gentle breeze carried the scent of pine resin and damp soil. The leaves above are brushed softly together. The forest opened slightly into a small clearing. Sunlight reached patches of grass. Ares crouched to inspect flowers scattered across the ground. Petals were yellow, white, and violet. Some leaves were damp with dew. Insects moved along the stems and petals. Bees landed briefly before flying away. He followed their movements. The path rose gradually toward a small hill. Grass brushed against his legs. Stones and roots required careful steps. One hand rested on a tree trunk. Bark pressed firmly against his palm. At the edge of the hill, Ares noticed movement deeper in the trees. Branches were bent and leaves were disturbed. Small animals scattered. The signs suggested that something larger had moved through recently. Ares slowed his pace. He crouched slightly, observing the direction of the disturbance. He advanced carefully. The trail led past ferns and small clusters of flowers. Insects moved along leaves and petals. He paused to place his hands in a nearby stream. The water was cold. Stones beneath his fingers shifted slightly. Small fish swam around, darting away from the disturbance of his hands. Ares continued along the trail. The forest became denser. Shadows lengthened. Roots and rocks made each step deliberate. He pressed hands against tree trunks for stability. Water, leaves, and small animals continued to produce constant sounds. He noticed a clearing ahead. The ground was disturbed. Broken branches and flattened grass suggested recent activity. Ares crouched, examining paw prints and footprints mixed together. The animal tracks were larger than before. The human-like footprints were narrow and small. They led further into the forest. He followed the trail slowly, stepping over roots and stones. The air was quiet except for distant sounds of water and rustling leaves. A light breeze carried scents of pine and damp earth. Suddenly, movement appeared at the edge of the clearing. A figure stepped forward from behind a tree. It was small and lightly built. Ares crouched slightly, observing. The figure moved cautiously. Its hands brushed against leaves and branches. It stopped occasionally, listening. Ares could see the outline clearly in the filtered sunlight. The figure bent down and picked up something from the ground, a stick or small stone. Its hands were small and nimble. The figure moved carefully, stepping over roots and stones. It paused, looking in Ares' direction, though it did not speak. Its posture was tense, ready to move if necessary. Ares observed the figure's movements. It stepped across a patch of grass, then stopped near a small stream. Water rippled as the figure bent to touch it. Ares crouched low, watching the reaction of the water and the way the figure adjusted its hands and balance on uneven stones. The figure moved closer to the trail. Its steps were quiet but deliberate. Ares adjusted his position slightly, keeping clear of the path while maintaining a view. The figure paused again, scanning the area. Small animals scattered from the surrounding underbrush. Birds flew from nearby trees. Ares observed as the figure knelt to inspect paw prints in the soil. It traced the edges with fingers, noting size and spacing. The figure then moved forward cautiously, stepping carefully over roots and stones, continuing deeper into the forest. Ares followed slowly, maintaining distance. Shadows grew longer as the sunlight filtered through the canopy. Roots and stones required careful steps. The trail narrowed. He pressed hands against tree trunks for balance. Leaves rustled, and water gurgled from the nearby stream. Small animals moved quietly into the underbrush. The figure paused again, kneeling beside a cluster of ferns. Its hands moved over the leaves, touching each gently. Ares watched silently. He noticed the small water droplets clinging to the edges of the leaves, occasionally falling to the ground. The figure's fingers traced the veins of the leaves before standing slowly. The figure moved toward a small hill. Ares followed, keeping a careful distance. Stones and roots required deliberate steps. The figure paused to touch the bark of a nearby tree, pressing palms against the rough surface. Ares observed the subtle movements of muscles in the arms and legs as the figure adjusted posture for balance. At the top of the hill, the figure paused again. Sunlight filtered through the branches, casting shadows across the ground. The figure looked in multiple directions, listening to the forest. Ares crouched slightly, noting the tension in the figure's shoulders and the careful placement of feet on uneven ground. The trail continued downward into a shaded area. Ares moved carefully, observing the figure. Small twigs snapped occasionally underfoot. The figure adjusted steps carefully, moving over roots and stones while keeping an alert posture. The forest was quiet except for distant streams and occasional bird calls. Ares maintained a steady pace, careful not to disturb the underbrush. The figure moved ahead, reaching a small clearing where sunlight touched the ground. It paused, scanning the surroundings again. Ares moved forward along the forest trail, keeping the previous figure in sight. The distance between them remained consistent, allowing him to observe without being noticed. The trail was uneven, scattered with stones and roots. His feet pressed against the soft soil, adjusting with every step. One hand rested against the rough bark of a tree to maintain balance. The air carried the scent of wet leaves and pine resin. Small droplets of water fell from the leaves above, landing on the ground with soft plinks. Ares inhaled and exhaled slowly, noting the changes in the forest scent as he moved deeper. The figure ahead paused near a small stream, crouching and touching the water. Ares observed as water rippled around the figure's hands. Small fish swam quickly away from the disturbance. Stones shifted slightly beneath the water's surface. The figure adjusted its posture, maintaining balance on the uneven stones. A rustling came from the underbrush nearby. Ares crouched slightly, observing a small rabbit dart across the path and into the foliage. Leaves moved lightly in its wake. The figure ahead continued cautiously, stepping over roots and stones while keeping hands close to the ground for stability. The trail began to slope upward. Stones and roots required careful, deliberate steps. Ares pressed one hand on a tree trunk for support. Bark was rough against his palm. A faint breeze moved through the branches above, carrying the scent of damp soil and pine needles. Small birds called from the treetops. The figure stopped at a cluster of ferns, kneeling to examine the leaves. Ares crouched behind a tree, observing. Water droplets clung to the leaves. The figure's fingers traced along the veins of each leaf carefully. After several moments, the figure stood and moved toward a small clearing. Ares followed, keeping distance. Grass brushed against his legs. Small stones shifted under his sandals. Roots protruded from the soil, requiring careful steps. The figure paused frequently, scanning the surroundings. Ares noticed the subtle tension in the figure's shoulders and the deliberate placement of feet for stability. A small stream ran along the edge of the clearing. The figure knelt and placed its hands in the water. Ripples moved outward, disturbing the smooth surface. Ares observed the reactions of small fish and the slight shifting of stones beneath the water. He continued moving slowly, pressing a hand against the bark of a nearby tree for balance. The trail narrowed. Trees grew closer together. Shadows deepened as sunlight filtered through the dense branches. Roots and rocks required careful foot placement. Ares advanced slowly, observing the figure as it moved toward a small hill. Small animals rustled in the underbrush, responding to movement. Leaves swayed gently with the occasional breeze. At the top of the hill, the figure paused, scanning the forest. Ares crouched behind a nearby tree, observing quietly. The figure's hands moved along the trunk of another tree for support. Stones shifted under its feet. Ares noticed the careful distribution of weight as the figure adjusted posture on the uneven ground. Suddenly, the figure bent down and picked up a small branch. Ares observed as it examined the branch, turning it over in hands. The figure then continued along the path, stepping over roots and stones, maintaining a steady pace. Ares followed at a cautious distance, careful not to disturb the soil or underbrush. The trail began to descend toward a shaded area. Ares stepped over roots and stones with deliberate movements. The figure paused near a small cluster of flowers, kneeling briefly to inspect the petals. Insects moved along the leaves. Ares watched the figure trace the edges of the petals with fingers, noting the small water droplets on their surfaces. The forest was quiet except for distant sounds of water, bird calls, and the occasional movement of small animals. Ares advanced slowly, careful not to make unnecessary noise. He observed the figure bending slightly, lifting a stone and placing it carefully back on the ground. A faint sound reached him from deeper in the forest. Leaves rustled more sharply. Small twigs snapped underfoot. Ares crouched slightly, adjusting his path. He observed the figure continuing forward cautiously, stepping over roots and stones. Small animals scattered into the underbrush. The figure approached a small clearing with sunlight touching the ground. Ares crouched low, observing. The figure paused, looking around. Small disturbances in the soil indicated recent movement by animals or humans. The figure's posture remained alert, with hands ready to balance on uneven ground. Ares noticed faint human footprints mixed with paw prints on the soil. He examined the spacing and depth, noting the pattern. The figure moved carefully, following the path deeper into the forest. Roots and stones required deliberate placement of feet. Ares pressed a hand against the rough bark of a tree, feeling the texture beneath his fingers. The trail led slightly uphill. Ares followed, maintaining distance. The figure paused near a small pond. Water rippled as hands touched the surface. Small fish moved quickly to avoid contact. Stones shifted slightly beneath the water. Ares observed, crouched behind a tree, noting every movement. The figure stood and moved toward a denser section of the forest. Shadows lengthened. Roots and rocks required careful footing. Ares moved cautiously, pressing hands on trunks when necessary. Leaves and branches brushed lightly against his arms. Small animals moved quietly into the underbrush. The figure paused again, listening to distant sounds. Ares crouched low, observing. The figure lifted a branch and placed it across a small root to stabilize footing. Ares watched each movement closely, noting the careful consideration in every step. The trail continued downward. Ares followed slowly, maintaining distance. The forest was quieter here. The only sounds were the movement of water in a nearby stream, leaves rustling with the wind, and occasional bird calls. The figure moved carefully, adjusting weight on uneven ground. At the bottom of the slope, the figure paused near a small patch of disturbed soil. Ares crouched behind a tree, observing quietly. The figure examined paw prints and footprints, moving hands gently across the edges of the impressions. After several moments, it continued forward along the trail. Ares followed, pressing his feet into soft soil carefully. Roots and stones required deliberate steps. Hands brushed against tree trunks for stability. The figure moved slowly, pausing occasionally to scan surroundings. Small animals moved into the underbrush in response to its movement. The trail led to a small clearing. The figure paused once more, scanning the area. Ares crouched low, observing carefully. The sunlight touched patches of grass. The figure moved to a nearby cluster of ferns, touching the leaves gently. Ares watched, noting the careful precision in each movement. Ares continued along the forest trail, keeping a careful distance from the figure ahead. The trees were dense here, branches low and closely spaced. Roots and stones crisscrossed the trail. He lifted his feet carefully, adjusting with each step. One hand pressed against the bark of a nearby tree for stability. The rough texture scraped slightly against his palm. The air carried the scent of damp earth, pine needles, and wet leaves. Small droplets fell from the leaves above, landing on the ground with soft sounds. A light breeze moved through the branches, rustling leaves and creating occasional small shifts in the underbrush. The figure ahead paused near a narrow stream. Water flowed steadily over smooth stones. Ares crouched slightly behind a tree, observing. The figure knelt and placed its hands in the water. Ripples spread outward. Small fish darted quickly away from the disturbance. Stones beneath the water shifted slightly as the figure lifted its hands. A rustling sound came from the underbrush. A small rabbit ran across the trail and disappeared into the foliage. Ares crouched, observing how the figure reacted. It turned slightly, scanning the forest, but did not move toward the disturbance. Its posture remained alert, balanced, and deliberate. The trail began to slope upward. Roots and stones forced careful steps. Ares pressed one hand against a tree trunk for support. The bark was rough, and small ridges pressed into his palm. A faint breeze carried the scent of pine resin and wet soil. Leaves moved above, brushing together softly. The figure paused at a patch of ferns. It crouched, moving its fingers carefully along the leaves. Tiny droplets of water clung to the edges. Insects crawled along the stems. The figure observed their movements before standing and moving toward a small clearing. Ares followed, maintaining a careful distance. Grass brushed against his legs. Small stones shifted under his sandals. Roots forced him to step carefully. The figure paused frequently, scanning the surroundings. Its hands adjusted lightly against uneven ground to maintain balance. Ares noted the subtle tension in the figure's shoulders and the precise placement of its feet. A small clearing appeared ahead. Sunlight touched patches of grass and soil. The figure paused near a cluster of flowers. It knelt briefly, touching the petals. Insects moved along leaves and petals. Water droplets clung to the edges. The figure's fingers traced the edges carefully before standing. Ares moved forward slowly. Shadows lengthened as the sun shifted. Roots and stones required deliberate placement of his feet. Hands brushed against tree trunks for balance. Leaves rustled above. Small animals moved quietly into the underbrush. The forest was otherwise silent. The figure moved toward a slight slope. Stones and roots required careful steps. Ares followed, maintaining distance. The figure paused, scanning the area. Its posture remained alert. It bent slightly to pick up a small stone, turned it over in hands, and placed it carefully back on the ground. The trail led into a denser section of the forest. Shadows grew longer. Roots and rocks made each step deliberate. Ares pressed hands against tree trunks for stability. Small animals scurried into the underbrush. Water flowed softly in a nearby stream. Leaves moved with occasional breezes. The figure paused near a cluster of ferns. Ares crouched behind a tree, observing. The figure examined the leaves, moving fingers carefully across the veins. Droplets of water fell to the ground. After several moments, it stood and moved forward along the trail. Ares followed, pressing feet carefully into soft soil. Roots and stones required deliberate steps. Hands brushed against rough bark for stability. The figure moved slowly, pausing occasionally to scan the surroundings. Small animals responded to its presence, moving into the underbrush. The trail led to a small clearing. The figure paused, scanning the area. Sunlight reached patches of grass. Aries crouched low, observing. The figure moved to a nearby cluster of ferns, touching the leaves gently. Its movements were precise, careful, and deliberate. Aries approached slightly closer, moving quietly. Roots and stones required careful foot placement. He pressed hands against tree trunks to maintain balance. The figure remained unaware of his presence. It bent down to examine the soil, fingers tracing faint paw prints and footprints. Aries observed each movement. The figure straightened, scanning the clearing again. Small animals stirred in response to subtle sounds. A light breeze moved through the branches. Leaves rustled softly. The figure adjusted footing, maintaining balance on uneven ground. Aries decided to step slightly forward. The figure turned its head, noticing him. Their eyes met briefly. The figure froze, posture tense but controlled. Aries stopped moving. The forest remained quiet except for distant water and occasional bird calls. The figure lifted a hand slightly, pointing toward a path that led deeper into the forest. Aries nodded slightly, acknowledging the direction. The figure moved first, stepping carefully over roots and stones. Aries followed closely, maintaining distance. The trail descended into a shaded area. Shadows deepened. Roots and rocks required deliberate steps. The figure paused again near a small stream. Hands touched the water, ripples spreading outward. Stones shifted slightly beneath the surface. Aries observed quietly, crouched behind a tree. The figure continued forward. Aries adjusted his footing, pressing hands against tree trunks for balance. Small animals scurried into the underbrush. Water gurgled softly in the nearby stream. Leaves brushed against his arms. The trail led to a larger clearing. The figure paused, scanning the area. Aries crouched low, observing. Sunlight touched patches of grass. The figure moved to a cluster of flowers, touching petals and leaves. Water droplets clung to edges. Insects moved along the plants. The figure traced the edges with fingers carefully. Aries maintained distance, observing the careful and deliberate movements. The forest remained quiet except for distant water and rustling leaves. Small animals continued moving away from the clearing. The figure paused, scanning the surroundings once more, then began moving forward along a faint trail leading deeper into the forest. Aries adjusted his pace, stepping carefully over roots and stones, pressing hands against trunks when necessary. The figure's movements were steady, controlled, and deliberate. Aries followed silently, observing, maintaining distance, ready to adjust to any change in terrain or movement. Aries continued along the forest trail. The figure ahead had stopped again in a small clearing. Sunlight filtered through the branches, touching patches of grass and leaves. Aries crouched behind a nearby tree, observing. The figure's posture was alert but relaxed, hands resting lightly against its legs. Small movements of the shoulders indicated careful listening to distant sounds. The trail was uneven. Roots and small stones crossed at irregular intervals. Aries lifted his feet deliberately, adjusting his balance. One hand pressed against a tree trunk for support. Bark pressed firmly against his palm. He tested each step on the soft soil before placing full weight. A faint breeze moved through the branches. The smell of wet leaves, pine needles, and damp earth was stronger here. Water droplets occasionally fell from the foliage onto the ground. Small insects moved along the leaves and grass, brushing lightly against Aries' legs as he adjusted his position. The figure crouched near a patch of flowers. Fingers traced lightly along the edges of petals. Water droplets clung to leaves and petals. Small insects crawled along the stems. The figure observed them briefly before standing. Aries noticed the precise placement of the figure's feet on uneven ground, shifting weight carefully with each step. Aries moved slightly closer, stepping carefully over roots and stones. The figure remained unaware. Shadows deepened as sunlight filtered through the thick canopy. Small birds called occasionally from the treetops. Leaves rustled softly with the light breeze. The figure paused at the edge of a small stream. Kneeling, it placed its hands in the water. Ripples spread outward, disturbing the smooth surface. Small fish darted quickly around the stones beneath the water. The figure lifted its hands, observing the ripples before standing slowly. Ares crouched behind a tree, adjusting position to maintain a clear view. The figure began walking toward a denser part of the forest. Ares followed quietly, keeping a safe distance. Grass brushed against his legs. Roots and stones required careful steps. Ares pressed his hands against tree trunks for stability. Small animals scurried into the underbrush in response to movement. The trail narrowed further. Trees pressed closely together. Shadows grew longer. Ares adjusted steps carefully over roots and stones. The figure moved cautiously, scanning surroundings, adjusting footing, hands brushing against trunks for balance. The forest was quiet except for distant water, occasional bird calls, and movement of small animals. At a small clearing, the figure paused. It crouched and examined a faint trail of footprints and paw prints in the soil. Fingers traced edges lightly. After several moments, the figure straightened and continued forward. Ares followed silently. He adjusted steps carefully, maintaining balance and observing each detail in the figure's movements. The figure approached a slight hill. Stones and roots required deliberate placement of feet. Ares pressed a hand against a nearby tree for support. Bark pressed firmly against his palm. The figure paused at the top, scanning the forest. Small animals moved away from the clearing. Leaves moved gently with a light breeze. Ares decided to move closer. He stepped lightly over roots and stones, keeping low to remain partially hidden. The figure paused, adjusting footing on uneven ground. Ares crouched behind a fallen log, observing. Its attention remained on the forest ahead. The figure knelt near a patch of ferns, touching leaves carefully. Small droplets of water fell to the ground. Insects moved along the leaves and stems. The figure examined the ferns briefly before standing. Ares noted the tension in its shoulders, indicating alertness. The figure moved closer to a shallow stream. Ares followed slowly. The figure placed hands in the water, causing ripples to spread. Small fish darted quickly to avoid disturbance. Stones beneath the water shifted slightly. The figure lifted hands, observing ripples before moving forward. Ares advanced cautiously, stepping carefully over roots and stones. Hands brushed against tree trunks for support. Small animals moved quietly into the underbrush. The forest was quiet except for distant water and occasional rustling leaves. The figure paused again in a small clearing, scanning the area. Ares crouched behind a tree, observing. Sunlight touched patches of grass. The figure moved to a cluster of flowers, touching petals lightly. Fingers traced edges carefully. Water droplets clung to petals and leaves. Insects crawled along the stems. Ares moved slightly closer. The figure did not notice. Roots and stones required careful steps. Hands pressed against trunks for stability. Shadows lengthened. Birds called softly from above. Leaves rustled lightly with the breeze. The figure stepped forward, following a faint path deeper into the forest. Ares followed silently, keeping distance. Each step required careful placement on roots and stones. Hands brushed against tree trunks to maintain balance. Small animals scurried into the underbrush. At the edge of another small clearing, the figure paused. Ares crouched low behind a tree, observing. The figure's posture was alert, hands ready to adjust balance on uneven ground. It looked around slowly, scanning the surroundings. Ares noted every movement, the precise placement of feet, the slight adjustment of weight, the gentle brush of hands along leaves and bark. The figure moved forward again. Ares followed carefully, adjusting steps over roots and stones. Shadows deepened. Small animals moved quietly into the underbrush. Water flowed softly in a nearby stream. Leaves rustled occasionally. The figure paused again, crouching near a cluster of ferns. Fingers traced along leaves, examining small water droplets. Ares observed silently. The figure straightened and began moving deeper into the forest. Roots and stones required deliberate steps. Hands brushed against trunks for stability. Small birds called in the treetops. The trail led to a slight hill. The figure paused at the top, scanning the surrounding forest. Ares moved closer, adjusting footing carefully. The figure remained unaware of his presence. He crouched behind a tree, observing closely. The forest remained quiet except for the distant sounds of water and rustling leaves. The figure bent slightly, picking up a small stone, turning it over, and placing it carefully back on the ground. The figure began descending the hill. Ares followed cautiously, stepping carefully over roots and stones. Hands pressed against trunks for balance. Small animals moved quietly away. The figure paused at the bottom, scanning the forest. Sunlight filtered through branches, touching patches of grass. Ares crouched low, observing. The figure moved to a small stream. Kneeling, it placed hands in the water. Ripples spread outward. Fish darted quickly. The figure lifted hands, observing ripples before standing. Ares watched silently, keeping distance, noting every detail. The figure turned slightly, noticing something in the distance. Ares remained hidden behind a tree, watching. The figure adjusted footing, continuing along a faint path leading deeper into the forest. Shadows lengthened. Roots and stones required deliberate placement. Hands brushed against trunks for stability. Ares followed carefully, observing. The figure paused again, crouching near a cluster of ferns, touching leaves gently. Small water droplets fell to the ground. Insects crawled along stems and petals. The figure examined them briefly before standing. Ares stepped forward carefully, moving over roots and stones along the narrow forest trail. The figure was ahead, standing at the edge of a small clearing. Sunlight touched patches of grass and soil. Ares crouched behind a tree, observing for a brief moment. The figure did not move, standing still with hands at its sides. Ares adjusted his footing. Stones shifted slightly beneath his sandals. Roots required deliberate steps. He pressed a hand against the rough bark of a tree for balance. The texture was firm and coarse against his palm. Leaves brushed lightly against his arms as he moved. The figure turned slowly. Its eyes met Ares. There was no sudden movement, no change in stance beyond a cautious observation. Ares stepped forward again. The figure remained in place. Sunlight filtered through the trees, touching patches of the forest floor. Ares moved another step. The figure tilted its head slightly, observing. Its hands rested lightly at its sides. Ares noted the precise placement of feet and careful posture. He stepped closer, remaining deliberate with each movement. A small stream ran near the clearing. Water flowed steadily over smooth stones. The figure moved toward it, bending to touch the water. Ripples spread across the surface. Small fish darted quickly to avoid the disturbance. The figure lifted its hands and observed the ripples. Ares crouched behind a tree, watching, adjusting his position carefully to maintain a clear view. The figure straightened and turned to face him fully. Ares stepped forward slowly, stopping several paces away. The figure remained still, hands slightly raised. Ares noted the way weight shifted between feet as the figure adjusted posture on uneven ground. He moved another step closer. The figure did not flinch. Sunlight touched the figure's shoulders and arms. Ares observed every movement, the subtle adjustment of hands, the careful placement of feet, the steady breathing. The figure lifted one hand and pointed toward the forest trail ahead. Ares nodded slightly. Without speaking, the figure stepped along the trail. Ares followed carefully, moving over roots and stones. Hands brushed against tree trunks for stability. Small animals rustled into the underbrush as they passed. The figure led him through the forest. The trail narrowed, shadows deepened. Roots and stones required deliberate placement of feet. Ares adjusted steps carefully, keeping pace. The forest was quiet except for distant water, bird calls, and movement of small animals. They reached a small hill. The figure paused at the top, scanning the surroundings. Ares stopped slightly behind. The figure then began descending the hill. Ares followed, careful with each step. Stones and roots required attention. Hands pressed lightly against trunks for balance. At the bottom of the hill, the figure moved to a clearing where sunlight touched the ground fully. Grass pressed against legs as they stepped forward. Small clusters of flowers were scattered across the clearing. The figure bent slightly, examining leaves and petals. Droplets of water clung to the surfaces. Small insects moved along stems. Ares observed quietly, stepping carefully over roots and stones. He noted every small movement. The figure straightened and turned fully to face him. Hands rested lightly at its sides. Ares stepped forward at another pace. The figure made no move to retreat. Ares lifted his hands slightly in acknowledgement. The figure mirrored the gesture. They stood silently for several moments. The forest was still except for distant water and rustling leaves. Sunlight filtered through branches, touching both of them. The figure turned toward the trail, leading deeper into the forest. Ares followed, matching steps carefully. Roots and stones required deliberate placement of feet. Hands brushed lightly against tree trunks. Small animals moved quietly into the underbrush. They reached a small stream. The figure knelt and placed hands in the water. Ripples spread outward. Fish moved quickly to avoid disturbance. The figure lifted hands and observed. Ares stepped forward slowly and touched the water as well. The cold ran over his fingers. Stones beneath shifted slightly. Small ripples spread from his hands, overlapping with those from the figure. The figure straightened and gestured toward a path beyond the stream. Ares followed. Grass brushed against my legs. Roots and stones required careful steps. Hands pressed lightly against tree trunks for balance. Shadows lengthened as the sunlight filtered through the trees. The figure paused at a small hilltop. Ares stepped closer. They observed the forest below. Streams, meadows, and small patches of sunlight were visible. The figure turned to Ares and nodded slightly. Ares nodded back. No words were spoken. They descended the hill carefully. Each step was deliberate. Roots and stones required attention. Hands pressed against trunks for stability. Leaves brushed lightly as they passed. Small animals moved into the underbrush quietly. At the bottom, the figure moved toward the edge of a larger clearing. Ares followed, keeping distance. Sunlight touched patches of grass and flowers. The figure bent slightly to examine petals. Water droplets clung to leaves. Insects moved along stems. Ares stepped closer, observing every movement. The figure straightened. Hands rested lightly at the sides. Ares did the same. They remained silent for several moments. The forest was calm, quiet except for distant water and soft rustling leaves. Finally, the figure stepped forward along a faint trail leading out of the forest. Ares followed. Stones and roots required careful steps. Hands pressed lightly against tree trunks. Grass and flowers brushed against my legs. Small animals scurried quietly into the underbrush. The trail opened onto a gentle meadow. Sunlight touched the grass fully. Ares observed the figure step forward. It paused at the center of the meadow and looked back. Ares stepped forward beside it. They remained silent. The figure turned and walked slowly to the edge of the forest. Ares followed. Sunlight touched the trail ahead. Grass and flowers moved lightly with a faint breeze. Roots and stones required careful steps. Hands brushed lightly against tree trunks for support. They reached the edge of the forest. The figure stopped. Ares stopped beside it. Both looked back at the path they had traveled through the trees. The forest was still. Leaves moved gently in the breeze. The figure stepped forward, following the trail out of the clearing. Ares followed. They reached the far edge of the meadow. The figure turned, glancing once at Ares. Ares nodded slightly. The figure nodded in return. They moved apart, walking separate paths. The forest behind them was quiet. Sunlight touched the clearing and patches of grass. Ares stepped onto the trail leading away. Each step was deliberate. Stones and roots required careful placement of feet. Hands brushed lightly against tree trunks. The forest remained calm, quiet except for distant water and rustling leaves. Ares walked forward. The figure disappeared along its path. Ares continued on his own. The forest remained still. Leaves moved softly in the breeze. Streams flowed quietly. Grass and flowers swayed lightly under the sunlight. Ares paused briefly at the edge of the trail. He observed the clearing and forest behind him. Everything was in place. Footprints and paw prints in the soil marked the passage through the forest. He stepped forward again, following the trail, moving steadily into the distance. The forest remained quiet. Sunlight filtered through the branches. Water flowed in streams. Small animals moved quietly into the underbrush. Aries continued walking, step by step, careful and deliberate, until the trail led fully beyond the forest and the figure was no longer visible. Aries stopped. He looked around once more. The forest was calm. Sunlight touched patches of grass and flowers. Streams flowed gently. Small animals moved quietly. Aries nodded slightly to himself and continued walking along the trail, leaving the forest behind.